Hi, and welcome to our Bitglass webinar. I'm Carmen Villegas, Director of Vendor Business Development for Bitglass. Today we have some special guests, Kevin Xu, VP of Marketing, and Bill Ng, Channel Sales Account Manager for Bitglass. Today we'll be explaining how to secure all users working from any device, any application, across any network. Also, while improving the workforce productivity and embracing high-speed home and mobile internet, as well as the partner programs and SPIS available to you. With that said, if we can go on to the next slide, please. And before we hand it off over to Kevin, just want to go over a few of our key differentiators for exclusive networks. Exclusive is key contribution to our industry is that we specialize in cybersecurity and cloud, maintaining a specialization with a narrow set of best-of-breed vendors such as Bitglass. In this way, exclusive networks can assist our channel community with vendor-specific and training, sales, design, implementation, and pre-staging, and of course, supply chain logistics, both domestically and globally. Filling in the gaps, helping many different types of partners to supply and deliver relevant multi-vendor solutions to their customers. And again, before I hand it over to Kevin and Bill, I'd like to remind you to please use the chat window for any questions. Kevin, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carmen. What we thought we'd do today, as Carmen mentioned, we'll take a look at, we felt like this was the right time, looking at 2021, to think about how we both maintain productivity this year while also securing those interactions that customers might see. And what we see, in my role, I run marketing at Bitglass, and we have a community of users who've gotten together over the course of the year to talk about, one, what they think 2021 is going to look like, and then two, given what 2021 is going to look like, how you enable both that pendulum of productivity as well as security. So we'll kind of actually break it into those two views. We'll share some of the perspectives on what this year will likely look like, although I think for the most part, we understand that there is going to be some gray for how we operate. And the second is then how you necessarily secure those and recommendations for how you would necessarily secure those. So I think it's helpful for us to think about where we are today. In many ways, I know in 2020, as we thought about the challenges that people were facing, a lot of the things that we were talking about, the challenges that people were talking about, these were not necessarily new things. They were just things that perhaps had become much more pronounced, or challenges that had become much more pronounced. Depending on your organization, some of these things might have been handled just via exceptions. And we found that in 2020, a lot of these were no longer exceptions, they were norms. And whether it be things like BYOD, you see a lot of companies handle things like BYOD on an exception basis. You saw new locations handled on a location basis. And a lot of these things ended up becoming normal things that had happened in 2020. Now, the question becomes, what happens as we go into 2021? And which of these things are likely going to remain going into the quote unquote new normal? We do know that if we look at what the world was beginning to look like going into last year, a lot of the things we had already been thinking about are likely here to stay. So things like BYOD and the explosion of devices, I think folks have learned a new way to become more productive, and a lot of that is not going away. We did see, of course, there are some scenarios where you have a company issued device. By nature of everybody working remotely, when that device stops working, it's harder to get access to like your IT help desk. And so by nature of that, we were forced to operate with BYOD as part of our norm. I think a lot of that is going to remain. I think what we've learned through all of this last year is that the new normal is actually here. A lot of the things that we had been talking about, whether it's because of zero trust, whether it's about the perimeter going away. The reality is that all of these trends have resulted in change in architecture, and for the security user and for the security teams, it really comes down to a matter of control. Whereas 5 years ago, maybe even 18 months ago, security and IT teams had full control of things like the endpoint, the device itself, the network, control points for the network, and also identity. I think what we've discovered in this last year, but also things that will likely continue as best practices moving forward, are that things like the devices may not be in full control of the IT teams. The IT teams and the security teams may not control all of the infrastructure. We today are communicating largely via home internet. And then we also know that by nature of a lot of these dynamics, user trust and identity by itself is not going to necessarily do it. But we know that by nature of all this new productivity that we've discovered is that there is a real potential for security and IT. In fact, in many ways, IT and security has never been in more control of the business. I think many of you, as you're either thinking about your own organizations or as you're interacting with other organizations, you realize that you are now actually seeing a seat at the table as a way of enabling the business, whether it's about just securing interactions or whether it's about enabling things like digital transformation and actually accelerating a lot of the business drivers that we would have been thinking about in years past. But of course, a lot of these things that we talked about are very difficult. And it's easy to think about how you would necessarily secure this, but whether it's about getting the right policies in place, whether it's about making sure that you're securing all the different interactions, whether it's coming from a managed device, an unmanaged device, how you incorporate in threat protection, how you consider all these different products that you have to buy across lots of different vendors, how you make sure that there's consistent policy enforcement across those. It's really complicated. It's easy to say, well, it's easy to say to secure it, but the reality is, how do you make sure that you have consistent security across the different threats, how you make sure that your data is handled in the same way, how you do it in a way that doesn't hamper productivity, and how you do it in a way that's cost effective. And these, in many ways, end up being a balance against each other. And as we talk to our customer base, I think this Gartner sentiment tends to be one that we see variations of. You see the sentiment that perhaps some companies don't expect employees to return to the office. I think initially there was some sentiment that we would never go back to how things used to work. I think we are starting to land at a middle ground where the discussion is shifting to how you support a hybrid working model. So say 3 days in the office and 2 days at home, or even an inverted version of that, or perhaps more of your staff is remote than you would have expected 12 months ago. And it goes back to that point that we had before. It's like, how do you manage without exceptions? Because if people are working part of the time at home, part of the time in the office, part of your staff is remote, part of it is in the office, it really does mean that exceptions go away. The BYOD, or unmanaged devices, unmanaged apps, how you give access to extended workforce. These things are no longer exceptions. These things are things that you have to handle as a normal, ongoing set of requirements. And that's when as we talk to our customers about how you think about securing both remote, fully remote, but also hybrid environments will matter. Now, I think McKinsey had a great research paper last year that continues to still hold. They found that working from home, the biggest security challenge was partially physical and partially technical, but also partially psychological. In the first quarter or so of everybody working remote, you started to see the impetus and the priority was how you get productive. And you had all of your users screaming at you on to get access to applications, to get access to resources. You started to see them start to behave in ways that that don't work so well. Like like this idea of the human firewall, like the best security is great human behavior. You started to see that break. So you started to see folks using their own apps with their Gmail accounts. You started to see this explosion of devices, and you started to see all sorts of new apps start to introduce themselves. And the trick of the matter is that it's a fine balance. All of those different behaviors really require you to enable them. You want to enable good access, but right access and proper access given the context of how that attempt is being made. You want to enable personal devices, but you want to do it in a secure way, or you want to enable it for a subset of direct use cases. And you want to be able to secure all of the interactions with the cloud. And the great news is that even before COVID and even before the pandemic, we were seeing great examples of this already work. For instance, one of our customers, it's a healthcare system. They had over 15,000 users. And if you think about the way a healthcare system often works, folks like doctors are actually belong to several different systems. They're logging into and out of lots of different systems. They're trying to secure the most sensitive information in the world. But also these doctors and these nurses, as they move between hospital systems, they might also be bringing their own devices. And they're bringing their own devices. They're logging into, in some cases, the same app, but with different credentials. And how do you necessarily secure that, given that type of movement, those type of users, and that type of data? And they were able to do it pretty simply. They distinguished between managed and BYOD devices. They limited that sensitive information access from unmanaged devices. They had proper DLP policies in place. And they also had advanced threat protection for any time that data was either moving, whether it's an upload or download from an application, or whether it was just sitting at rest and being able to scan it for any sensitive information that perhaps shouldn't be there, or perhaps were unexpectedly there. And when you look at a model like that, there are some simple tenets that allow you to get there. You can, I mean, part of it is moving everything from your on-prem legacy infrastructure to the cloud. Part of it is about centralizing policies. Those examples that we talked about are a fairly broad set of interactions between applications, the web, and it certainly exposes yourself to different elements. And whether the control point is about advanced threats, data security, identity, or app control, you want to be able to do those in one central repository or one central dashboard. And as we think about moving from on-prem to cloud, it also allows you to do it simply. It allows you to do it cost effectively. But also by nature of thinking about it as a cloud, you could also pretty quickly and dynamically adapt to changes in workloads. And in many ways, they deployed an architecture that was able to scale up and down as people moved between different systems and locations, but also it allowed you to eliminate backhaul bottlenecks, which we'll talk about in just a second as well. So this is one example of how you might think about that solutions architecture. It's a simple drawing, but in effect, you have BYOD devices and managed devices as the points of access. And then you're accessing SaaS applications, you're accessing internal applications from remote locations, and you're also managing or trying to access kind of the great unwashed, if you will, of web traffic. You're trying to go to lots of web destinations, whether known or unknown. And if you break down how these work, it kind of comes down to identity, access control, data protection, as well as threat protection. So take an example like an unmanaged device trying to access your SaaS applications. You want to make sure you have the right identity and controls in place for those applications. You want to be able to make sure that that's in place for both managed as well as unmanaged apps. But you also want to make sure that there's modular policy controls in place, whether it so that you can have different policies depending on which apps you have in place. You could have over 50 different SaaS applications and then be able to either coalesce policies for a group of those applications, or be able to set really specific ones in the case that you have, say, a custom app. Let's say in the hospital system, they will likely have apps that nobody else is using. And in that case, you'll want to use some of the most stringent and restrictive access policies there, just because you know what's being accessed might be the most sensitive. And then in line with that, also making sure that you have threat protection to scan it when it's at rest, or to scan them whether they're on download or also upload. You also want to make sure that some of the threats nowadays, the first compromised often is the malware first being uploaded into something like OneDrive, and then somebody else downloading that piece of malware thinking that it's just a regular file, and then from there laterally spreading and then reaching some form of impact. Now, ZTNA is just as important. If you're a remote user, you're trying to access internal apps, this is making sure that you have points of control for both access, but also those same controls that you have in place that you're thinking about for your SaaS apps, whether it's about your data loss policies, whether it's about who can access it, but also making sure you have threat protection in place for internal apps, just like you would for SaaS apps, is just as important. And then as you think about web traffic, perhaps the one thing that is unique here is being remote puts new requirements on how you think about web security. Web security has been around for a long time, but we have not taken performance fully into account until this last year. And if you think about a traditional model where you perhaps have a gateway sitting at the egress point of your infrastructure, if I, sitting at home, have to boomerang my traffic to, or backhaul my traffic to that gateway, and then from the gateway go on to the internet, my traffic is going to be fairly degraded. One, just because of the routing path, but part of it is also because now that gateway becomes a bottleneck. If my entire company suddenly has to go through that choke point, inevitably my performance degrades. And so no matter how great that web security and secure web gateway might be, it's moot if it becomes non-performant. And I'll kind of walk through an option that we often find really helpful here as we think about performance on that last point. It speaks to the importance of, one, where you have it, where you secure it, and where you enforce those policies, and then what the underlying architecture is. The one option we often look at, and what's more this legacy approach, which is what I just talked about, if you have to boomerang all of your traffic back to headquarters, you're going to have limitations on your performance. The inverse of this will be putting that security functionality directly on your device. So you don't even have to reach the internet. You're not even using any sort of networking in order before the security policies are enforced. And so that performance becomes a significant factor as you think about whether secure web gateway is the right choice, whether your secure web gateway is the right architecture. On top of that, also the underlying architecture matters as well. I think today the sort of rack and stack or private cloud model that is static is, you're starting to see the seams of that break. And so an architecture that is highly modular, highly modern, that is built on the public cloud allows you to take that underlying architecture, break it into individual nodes, self-monitors itself, and then auto-scales each component depending on what functionality you're implementing. So let's say you're putting more DLP policies in place, or you have threat protection in place. Those nodes scale up as you move, or as you use that functionality, or as you move, or in the future as we move, then being able to scale in a different geographic location becomes really important as well. Not only today, perhaps we're a little bit less mobile, but in the future, you might travel somewhere for a conference, you might travel somewhere for a meeting, you might travel back and forth between your home location and your office. All these things require the underlying architecture to automatically scale itself. And this is an example of what happens when you use that type of auto scale architecture. We call it polyscale just because it's polymorphic scaling. If you take a couple of these customer examples and these users, you see variations of this where what legacy private cloud architectures might take either hours or days to be able to complete a scan. These are brought down by several fold. In many cases, they actually complete versus models where in a private cloud architecture, as you're adding more files that need to be scanned or as files change, some of these cases, they actually never finish scanning just because the rate of scanning isn't keeping up with the rate of changes that are occurring inside of the infrastructure. And so this speaks to the value of having that type of architecture that is nimble, that is fluid, but also automatically adapts to how the architecture works or how your user patterns adapt. And just the last point as well, we often get this question from our customers as they think about digital transformations, as they think about adjusting for what this new normal looks like. Some think of it as an additional budget line item. We actually have a lot of customers who think about and have realized that the ROI on some of these adjustments and some of these migrations and transformations are actually cost accretive. They're able to cut the costs on appliances and software. They're able to automatically scale. You often don't have excess capacity sitting around when you have static architecture. You often overcapacitate yourself, and a lot of this capacity actually sits unused. And also, you start to see that the maintenance costs start to go down as well. And you're also able to see that in many cases, security teams are much more nimble. They're able to deploy more quickly. The amount of overhead that they have to handle is much quicker as well. So hopefully that provides some perspective on how we think about the new normal, what the new normal might look like in 2021, but also some perspectives across our community on how folks are thinking about securing, but also investing in this environment. Before we go to more questions, any questions folks might have on the line on this topic, I'll hand it over to Bill to chat about and share some of the information about our channel resources.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. That was really great insight to kind of what to expect in this market for 2021. Just wanted to let everyone know that first of all, I'm the channel account manager for Bitglass covering the Western region, but wanted to talk about some programs that we have available to you as a Bitglass reseller. So as of today, we have free training and certification. We have 2 tracks. One is a sales track that's on-demand sales training that can be done and can be found and completed within our partner portal. It's a 45-minute, it typically takes around 45 minutes to go run through all the modules and is served up with a quiz at the end. So really easy way to get trained quickly on Bitglass, and it is a certified course, meaning upon completion, you will get a official Bitglass certificate of completion for sales training. We're also offering a SE track. So for all you SEs out there, we host a technical training and certification that is instructor led. Obviously, it's done virtually today. Typically, it's going to require 2 half days. But essentially, our channel SE, Justin Crowley, he will go through the positioning of Bitglass, go through some of the architecture, and then provide tenets for you to access and configure Bitglass. So this will cover all of our core technologies, CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, SWIG, which is our new secure web gateway solution that we've launched this year, and then ZTNA. Our next training will be on February 23rd and 24th from 12 to 4 p.m. Eastern. And I will, after I hand it back to Carmen, I will put a link to that landing page, and you are more than welcome to register for those sessions. And then next slide, please. For 2021, we're actually continuing our SPIF program that we had for most of 2020. So we are incentivizing both sales reps and our partner SEs for Bitglass deals. And essentially, you can earn up to $750 in cash per deal for this program. So $250 for every new meeting brought to Bitglass. And then if that meeting turns into an opportunity, which goes through the POC process, we will spiff the SE $500 once a POC is kicked off. There is a minimum opportunity value that is required at 50K, and the program runs from January, the beginning of this year, all the way through June 30th of 2021. Next slide, please. And the last thing I'll leave you off with is to, if you haven't already and you're already a Bitglass partner, is to sign up for Partner Portal Access. This will give you access to deal registration and lead tracking, full access to partner exclusive content in our asset library to enable you to effectively pitch and sell our solutions, and then access to the training that I'd mentioned on the first slide, and then more enablement tools. But last but not least, it's going to allow you to opt into our monthly newsletter and any enablement webinars that we do. And we typically do them every 1 to 2 months. It's the Rock the Casby Partner Series. And I think that wraps up this section. So I'll hand it back over to Carmen, and I will put the link to our training in the chat. So Carmen.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Kevin. Again, if you guys want to get additional information or get a personalized demo and do a deep dive on this Bitglass solution, feel free to contact myself, or my details are here, or your dedicated exclusive networks account manager, and then we can happily set that up for you. Also want to make sure you guys follow us on our social media. That way you can get all of our latest news and updates, as well as our offerings that we have. And also keep an eye out for our Exclusive Networks monthly newsletter, where you'll see a consolidated snapshot of all of our vendor news, tools, and upcoming events that we're having. Next slide, please. And here you see the best of breed vendors that were mentioned earlier in the webinar. Again, if you want to learn more about Bitglass or any of our other vendors, please contact your dedicated exclusive account manager or myself. And now we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Next slide, please. And Josh, I'll hand it over to you to go over any questions that.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you, Bill, and thank you, Kevin. So we do have a few questions here. First question is, do you recommend getting the same advanced threat detection engines as what we have on the Endpoint?
That's a good question. And I'll just give the perspective of what we see, because I think folks kind of handle it differently. But we perhaps what we are seeing more and more often is that folks like the idea of having multiple advanced threat engines deployed. Part of it is, I think, some acknowledgement that nobody or no vendor is perfect. So perhaps if you don't catch something at the endpoint, or if something at the endpoint isn't identified, you would then catch it either in the cloud or in transit to and from the cloud. So I think there's one perspective that there's benefit to just having more perspective. Of course, there is this other trade-off that we see, like sometimes if you have more engines, it does mean that you're managing more vendor engines as well. But we are starting to see more and more people think about having more than one engine in different places in order to give them more robustness in their architecture.
Perfect. And how would you prioritize or sequence these recommendations?
Good question. You know, I think it varies depending on where people are in their journey. You know, and I hate the term journey, but I think it's just everybody is in a sort of different place depending on where they're at. But I would say in many ways, not that this is a cop-out per se, but I actually think it's about understanding where your data is. So rather than think about it as, you know, we in this webinar or in this discussion categorized it as like a CASB type use case, a secure web gateway type use case, and a ZTNA type use case. I would recommend first thing before anything is one, just categorizing where your data sits, how that is being accessed and used, and then from there, I think you can get a better understanding of like where the gaps are in your in your data flows, and then from there you can kind of more easily build out what the architecture might look like and the sequence of when you might deploy it.
Okay, and are there any pitfalls that you commonly see when implementing these recommendations?
You know, I think the biggest pitfall that I think we're starting to see, but also is one that is likely to continue moving forward, is the point we made towards the latter part of the discussion. I think we talk about cloud as if all cloud is the same and all architectures are the same. I think the matter of performance and whether your security is performing at a good, or just performance as in like bandwidth capacity and making sure there's no bottlenecks or choke points will become an important factor as we think about security in the cloud. Security in the cloud or cloud security is going to be very different from on-prem security, and no different than perhaps folks needing to get more capacity as they were securing their on-prem infrastructure 5 years ago. That is still a relevant question as we move into this new normal.
Perfect, thank you, Kevin. And that seems to be all of our questions for today. So thank you everyone for joining and have a great rest of your day.